Charlotte balanced a tray of cocktails in one hand, weaving through the crowded rooftop bar, when a deep, confident voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, I think there's been a mistake." She turned, her polite waitress smile already in place, only for it to falter slightly when she saw him. He was devastatingly handsome, sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, tailored navy suit that screamed money. The kind of man who belonged in a penthouse, not at a dimly lit bar in downtown Chicago. Charlotte straightened. "What seems to be the problem?" The man glanced at the glass in front of him, then back at her. "I ordered a Negroni." "This is an old-fashioned." She swallowed, heat creeping up her neck. She hadn't messed up an order in months. "I'm so sorry, sir." "I'll fix that right away." He studied her for a moment, as if he wasn't used to people correcting their mistakes so easily. "You don't seem like you belong here," he said casually. Charlotte frowned. "Excuse me." His lips curled slightly. "You carry yourself differently, not like the other staff." She stiffened. "I don't know what that means, but I'm just a waitress, sir." His gaze lingered on her, intrigued. "Just a waitress," he echoed, as if testing the words. She didn't have time for whatever game rich men played with people like her. Without another word, she turned and headed back to the bar, pushing away the strange flutter in her chest. Graham Kensington watched her go, curiosity flaring in his chest. He had only come here to escape the suffocating world of corporate mergers and multi-million-dollar deals. He hadn't expected to find someone interesting. She was beautiful in an effortless way, long dark hair pulled into a ponytail, hazel eyes that flashed when she was annoyed, a confidence that didn't match her uniform. "Sir," his assistant, Logan, leaned down to whisper, "I just got word that the investors in London are waiting for your call." Graham sighed. "They can wait." His attention drifted back to Charlotte as she moved behind the bar, expertly mixing drinks. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place. And Graham Kensington wasn't used to wanting something he couldn't immediately have. An hour later, Charlotte was wiping down the bar when she felt a presence nearby. She turned, unsurprised to see the same man watching her. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying not to notice how ridiculously attractive he was up close. He smirked. "I never got your name." She hesitated before answering. "Charlotte." "Charlotte," he repeated as if savoring the sound. "I'm Graham." She nodded, uninterested. "Well, Graham, do you need another drink?" He chuckled. "No, I need to know why you work here." She blinked. "Why does that matter?" "Because I have a feeling you're more than a waitress." Her stomach twisted. If only he knew, but she wasn't about to spill her life story to some rich stranger. "I don't see how that's any of your business." His smirk only widened. "Maybe not, but I'd like it to be." She narrowed her eyes. "Is this your idea of flirting?" "Because if it is, you need to work on your technique." To her surprise, he laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "Noted." She shook her head and turned away, but she could still feel his eyes on her. And for some reason, she didn't mind as much as she should have. For the next few nights, Graham kept coming back. Charlotte told herself it was a coincidence, that he just liked the bar. But deep down, she knew better. He always sat in her section, always found a way to talk to her, and the more he did, the harder it became to ignore him. "So, Charlotte," he said one evening as she placed his drink in front of him, "what's your dream?" She scoffed. "That's an awfully personal question." He shrugged. "I'm an awfully persistent man." She sighed, wiping her hands on a towel. "If you must know, I'm studying business. But tuition isn't cheap, so here I am." His expression shifted slightly as if something clicked in his mind, but he didn't press. Instead, he simply said, "I think you'll do great things." Something in his voice made her stomach flip. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, getting to know Graham Kensington wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The next night, he wasn't there. Charlotte told herself she didn't care. But as the hours ticked by, she found herself glancing at the door more times than she wanted to admit. It wasn't like they were friends. He was just some rich guy who liked to flirt, except it didn't feel like that. Just as she was about to take her break, the door swung open, and there he was. But he wasn't alone. A stunning blonde woman clung to his arm, laughing at something he said. She was effortlessly elegant, the kind of woman who belonged in his world. Charlotte's stomach tightened. Of course. She had been stupid to think he was any different from the others. He caught her eye across the room. His expression shifted immediately, like he hadn't expected her to see this. But she had. And whatever foolish idea she'd entertained about him disappeared in an instant. Charlotte forced herself to turn away, her heart pounding in a way that made her angry. This was ridiculous. She had no reason to care who Graham Kensington walked into the bar with. He was a customer, a rich, arrogant customer who had been playing some game with her for the past week. And she had been foolish enough to let herself be entertained by it. She grabbed an empty tray and busied herself clearing tables, refusing to acknowledge his presence. But she felt him. Every time she moved, it was as if his gaze was following her, burning into her skin like a silent question. It wasn't until she returned to the bar that she realized he had approached, standing at the counter while the blonde woman lingered at their table, scrolling through her phone. "You're ignoring me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Charlotte didn't look up as she stacked glasses. "I have a job to do." A pause. "She's my business associate." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "I don't remember asking." "You didn't," he admitted. "But I wanted to explain anyway." Finally, she met his gaze, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "You don't owe me an explanation, Graham. We're strangers." Something flickered across his face, something she couldn't quite place. He leaned in slightly, his voice soft but intense. "Are we?" Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to remain impassive. "Enjoy your evening," she said coolly, turning away before he could say anything else. She told herself that was the end of it. That he'd go back to his glamorous world with his glamorous people and forget all about the waitress he'd spent far too much time bothering. But of course, Graham Kensington wasn't the kind of man who let things go. The next night he returned. Alone. Charlotte had half expected it, though she wouldn't admit it to anyone. He took his usual seat at the bar and didn't order right away. Instead, he watched her, waiting until she had no choice but to approach. "What do you want?" she asked, not unkindly but with enough distance to make it clear she wasn't falling for whatever charm he was trying to use on her. He tapped the counter. "A conversation." She raised an eyebrow. "Sounds expensive. We charge extra for those." He smirked, but there was something sincere in his expression. "I meant what I said." "She's just a business associate, and I don't play games, Charlotte." She exhaled slowly, gripping the counter to ground herself. "I don't know what you want from me, Graham." His gaze darkened, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "I don't either. But I can't seem to stay away." The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she hated that they did. Hated that, despite everything, she wanted to hear more. But she was smart enough to know better. So she straightened, plastering on the professional smile she had perfected over the years. "Well, if you figure it out, let me know. Until then, can I get you a drink?" He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Negroni." She turned to make it, ignoring the way her fingers trembled just slightly. Days passed and Graham kept coming back. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, and despite herself, Charlotte found that she enjoyed them. She learned little things about him, like how he hated olives, but still ordered martinis just to seem intimidating in meetings. Or how he had a dog named Archer that he rarely had time to walk. And he learned about her too, not everything. She kept certain parts of herself guarded: the struggles, the sacrifices, the weight of trying to build a future on her own. But somehow he saw through her anyway. One night, as she wiped down the counter, he leaned in slightly, his voice softer than usual. "Have dinner with me." She froze, heart hammering. "Graham." He smirked. "Before you say no, just think about it." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't think that's a good idea," he exhaled, tilting his head. "Because you don't want to." "Or because you do?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. It was 2 days before she saw him again. This time, he didn't come to the bar, he waited outside. Charlotte stepped out after her shift, rubbing her arms against the evening chill, only to halt when she saw him leaning against a sleek black car. "What are you doing here?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. He shrugged. "I figured if you wouldn't have dinner with me on my terms, I'd try yours." She frowned. "What does that mean?" He gestured behind him, and that's when she saw it. A small, late-night diner across the street, the kind of place she actually liked, the kind of place that felt real. Her throat tightened. "Graham." "No expectations," he said simply. "Just 2 people having a meal, nothing more." She should have walked away, but instead she found herself nodding. And just like that, everything changed. Dinner was easy, too easy. They sat in a booth by the window, the city lights casting a soft glow over their table. And for the first time, Charlotte saw a different side of him. He wasn't just the smooth billionaire who haunted her bar with his cryptic smiles. He was funny, sharp, thoughtful in a way she hadn't expected, and when he laughed, really laughed, it did something strange to her chest. She hated that she liked it. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle," he noted, sipping his coffee. She tilted her head. "Maybe I am," he smirked. "And what have you figured out so far?" She hesitated, then said, "That you're not as put together as you pretend to be." Something flickered in his gaze, something raw. "Neither are you," he murmured, her breath caught. And suddenly the space between them felt too small, too charged. She needed to leave. Standing abruptly, she grabbed her coat. "I should go." Graham's expression remained unreadable, but he didn't stop her. He only said, "I'll see you soon, Charlotte." And somehow she knew he would. Charlotte told herself she wouldn't see Graham again. That dinner had been a mistake, a moment of weakness where she'd let herself believe, just for a second, that a man like him and a woman like her could exist in the same world. But Graham Kensington wasn't the kind of man who disappeared. The next night he was at the bar again, sitting in his usual spot, watching her with the same unreadable intensity that always made her pulse spike. She ignored him, or at least she tried. She focused on her job, on the customers, on anything that wasn't the way his presence seemed to shift the air around her. But when she finally turned, he was already there, standing at the bar, waiting. "You're persistent," she muttered, wiping down the counter. He smirked. "You make it necessary." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Graham, don't say it," he interrupted, his voice softer than usual. "Don't tell me you don't want me here." She swallowed, gripping the cloth in her hands, because the truth was she didn't want him to leave, and that terrified her. "I don't fit into your world," she said finally, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His smirk faded. "Then maybe my world needs to change." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught her attention. A man had stumbled in, drunk and belligerent, waving his arms as he shouted at the hostess. Charlotte recognized him instantly, one of their regulars, the kind who didn't know when to quit. She sighed, already moving to intervene. "I've got this," she muttered to Graham, stepping around the bar, but before she could reach the man, he grabbed the hostess's arm, yanking her forward. The reaction was immediate. 1 second, Graham was at the bar. The next, he was between them, his hand gripping the man's wrist in a way that made it clear there was no room for negotiation. "Let go," Graham said, his voice dangerously calm. The drunk man blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Who the hell are you?" Graham tightened his grip just slightly. "The man who's about to make you regret that decision." A tense silence filled the air. For a moment, Charlotte thought the man might push back. But then he yanked his arm away, muttering something under his breath before stumbling toward the exit. Graham didn't move until the door swung shut behind him. Only then did he turn to Charlotte, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" she exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah, I just didn't expect that." He studied her for a moment, then said, "Neither did I." Something passed between them, then something unspoken, something that made the world around them blur for just a second. And Charlotte knew, with startling clarity, that she was in trouble. Because Graham Kensington wasn't just some billionaire with a charming smirk and an expensive suit. He was something else entirely, and she had no idea how to stop herself from falling. The next morning, Charlotte woke up to a text from an unknown number. "Dinner. Tonight, no excuses." She stared at the message, her heart pounding. She knew exactly who it was from, and despite every warning in her head, she found herself typing back a single word. Fine. Dinner with Graham Kensington was exactly what she expected, and nothing like she expected at all. He didn't take her to some over-the-top 5-star restaurant with white tablecloths and a dress code. Instead, he took her to a quiet, intimate place tucked away in the city, where the lighting was soft and the food was simple but perfect. "You surprise me," she admitted as they sat across from each other, a glass of wine in her hand. His lips curved slightly. "Good." "I'd hate to be predictable." She took a sip, watching him carefully. "So, tell me something real." He tilted his head. "Something real. No business talk, no charm. Just something real about you." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I don't trust people easily." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She set her glass down. "Why not?" he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because when you grow up with money, you learn early on that most people only want something from you." She frowned. "That sounds lonely." He met her gaze. "It is." Her chest tightened. She had expected a lot of things from Graham Kensington, but she hadn't expected this. And that scared her more than anything. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was protecting herself from him, or from the way he made her feel. Charlotte knew she should have walked away after that night, but she didn't. She couldn't. Because Graham had a way of pulling her in, of making her forget all the reasons they didn't make sense. And before she knew it, he wasn't just a customer at her bar. He was something more. Something dangerous. Something she wasn't sure she could survive. One evening, as they walked through the city after dinner, he suddenly stopped, turning to face her. "I have to leave for London tomorrow," he said, studying her carefully. Her stomach dropped. "For how long?" "A week. Maybe 2, she nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "That makes sense." He frowned. "That's all you have to say," she shrugged. "It's your job, right?" His jaw tightened. "Charlotte," she exhaled, crossing her arms. "What do you want me to say, Graham? That I'll miss you?" "Yes." The word was quiet but firm, her breath caught, and for once she couldn't find a clever way out. So she whispered, "I'll miss you." His eyes darkened, and before she could say anything else, he stepped closer, his hands sliding to her waist. Her heart pounded as he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear as he murmured, "Say it again." She swallowed hard. "I'll miss you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't slow, it wasn't tentative. It was everything they had been holding back, everything they had pretended wasn't simmering beneath the surface. And in that moment, Charlotte knew there was no walking away from him now. Charlotte stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne flute as she scanned the glittering crowd. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the soft hum of a string quartet playing in the background. It was the kind of event she had never been invited to before until now. Until Graham Kensington had changed everything. She wasn't sure how she had let herself get here. One second, she had been telling herself she could keep things casual, that whatever had happened between them before he left for London had been a fleeting moment, nothing more. But then he had returned, and instead of fading away, their connection had only intensified. And now, here she was, standing in the middle of his world. She smoothed down the fabric of her midnight blue gown, the one Graham had sent to her apartment earlier that afternoon with a note that simply read, "Wear this. I'll be waiting." Charlotte had almost refused, almost, but something in her had wanted to see him to step into his life, even if just for one night. And now she wasn't sure if she had made a mistake. Looking for someone, the deep, familiar voice sent a shiver down her spine. She turned, and there he was. Graham stood just a few feet away, dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been made for him, which, knowing him, it probably had. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, a slow, knowing smile curving his lips. "You clean up nicely," he murmured, stepping closer. Charlotte arched a brow, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. "Are you saying I don't usually?" His smirk deepened. "I'm saying that tonight I might have a hard time keeping my hands to myself." Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to roll her eyes. "You're impossible. And yet you're here." She hated that he was right. Before she could respond, a man approached, clapping Graham on the shoulder. "Kensington, there you are. I've been meaning to discuss your latest acquisition." Graham's jaw tightened slightly, but he turned to the man with a polite nod. "Excuse me for a moment," he murmured to Charlotte before stepping aside to engage in conversation. Charlotte exhaled, taking a sip of her champagne. She didn't belong here. She could feel it in the way people glanced at her, in the subtle curiosity in their eyes. They all knew who Graham was, and they all knew she wasn't one of them. A woman with perfectly styled hair and a designer gown sauntered up beside her, sipping her own drink as her gaze flickered toward Graham. "You must be Charlotte," the woman said smoothly. Charlotte turned cautious. "And you are Vivienne St. Clair." The name sounded expensive, and Charlotte had no doubt it was. "Graham and I go way back." Charlotte forced a polite smile. "Is that so?" Vivienne hummed, tilting her head. "You know, men like Graham Kensington don't settle down. They get distracted for a while, but eventually they remember who they are." Charlotte's grip on her glass tightened. "And who is he exactly?" Vivienne's smile didn't waver. "Someone who plays by his own rules. I wouldn't get too comfortable if I were you." Before Charlotte could respond, Vivienne sauntered away, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and carefully placed doubt. Charlotte's stomach twisted. She wasn't naive. She knew Graham was powerful, wealthy, and used to getting what he wanted, but was she just a temporary amusement? She barely had time to process the thought before Graham was back at her side, his gaze sharp as he studied her. "What did she say to you?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing I didn't already know," Charlotte replied, trying to keep her tone even. Graham's jaw clenched. "Charlotte, I should go," she interrupted, setting her champagne down on a passing tray. "This isn't my world, Graham." His hand caught her wrist before she could step away. "You are my world." Her breath caught. He exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening just slightly. "Come with me." She hesitated, but something in his eyes, something raw and real, made her nod. He led her through the grand hall, past curious glances and whispered conversations, until they reached a set of glass doors that opened onto a private terrace. The cool night air wrapped around them as they stepped outside. Graham turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't care what Vivienne or anyone else says." "You belong here if you want to," Charlotte swallowed, "and if I don't," his gaze darkened, "then I'll walk away from all of this." Her eyes widened. "Graham, I mean it." His voice was rough with emotion. "None of it matters without you." She searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, of doubt, but there was none. And just like that, the last of her resistance crumbled. She surged forward, crashing her lips against his, pouring every fear, every feeling, every unspoken word into the kiss. Graham responded instantly, his hands sliding to her waist, pulling her flush against him. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing heavily. "Stay," he murmured. She exhaled, her fingers gripping the lapels of his tuxedo. "I'm scared. I know." His thumb brushed over her cheek. "But I'll spend the rest of my life proving you don't have to be." And in that moment, Charlotte knew she wasn't running anymore. The city stretched below them, its golden lights shimmering like a sea of stars as Charlotte stood on the terrace, wrapped in Graham's arms. The distant hum of music and conversation from the ballroom had faded into nothing, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat and the warmth of his touch. She had never felt this way before, like she was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, yet utterly irresistible. Graham exhaled softly, his fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles against the small of her back. "You're thinking too much," he murmured. Charlotte huffed a quiet laugh, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. "That's what I do." His lips curved slightly, but there was something deeper in his eyes, a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Then let me make it simple for you." Before she could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Charlotte's breath caught, her pulse hammering as he flipped it open, revealing a delicate diamond bracelet that shimmered under the terrace lights. "Graham," she started, but he cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "This isn't a bribe," he said. "It's not some grand gesture to convince you of anything. It's just a reminder," her throat tightened. "Of what? That you belong with me." His voice was quiet but firm, leaving no room for doubt. "No matter what anyone says. No matter what you think." Charlotte's fingers trembled as he lifted the bracelet from the box, sliding it carefully onto her wrist. It was light and cool against her skin, but it carried a weight far heavier than gold or diamonds. She looked up at him, searching for the right words, but nothing felt like enough. Instead, she simply whispered, "Why me?" Graham's expression softened. "Because you see me, Charlotte, not my name, not my money, just me." Her chest ached at the raw honesty in his voice. She had spent so much time convincing herself that they were too different, that his world would eventually swallow her whole. But standing here, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingertips, she realized something. She didn't want to run anymore. She reached up, cupping his face between her hands, and kissed him. It was slow this time, deliberate, filled with every unspoken thing that had been building between them from the moment they met. Graham responded instantly, his arms tightening around her, deepening the kiss until the rest of the world melted away. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. Charlotte's heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "Yes." The car ride to his penthouse was a blur of stolen glances and the quiet hum of anticipation. By the time they stepped into the sleek, modern space that overlooked the city, Charlotte barely had time to take in her surroundings before Graham was pulling her to him again. His hands traced her waist, his lips brushing against her ear as he murmured, "Tell me if you want me to stop." She shook her head, threading her fingers through his hair. "I don't." That was all it took. The night unfolded like a slow, burning dream, every touch, every kiss, every whispered name spoken as if it was the only thing that mattered. And maybe, for that moment, it was. When morning arrived, Charlotte woke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Graham was still beside her, his arm draped over her waist, his breathing even and steady. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist in this space. To memorize the way his skin felt against hers, the warmth of his body, the quiet safety she hadn't realized she had been craving. But reality had a way of creeping back in. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, grabbing the silk robe draped over a nearby chair. As she moved toward the windows, her eyes landed on a framed photograph on one of the shelves. Graham standing beside an older man, both of them dressed in suits, their expressions unreadable. She hadn't asked much about his family. He never talked about them, and she had assumed it was intentional, but something about that photo made her pause. Before she could dwell on it, she felt movement behind her. "You're up early." Graham's voice was thick with sleep as he stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a slow kiss to her shoulder. Charlotte leaned into him, exhaling softly. "Couldn't sleep," he hummed against her skin. Thinking again, she smiled despite herself. "Always." Graham turned her gently to face him, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Talk to me." She hesitated, then glanced back at the photo. "Your father," his expression shifted slightly, but he didn't look away. "Yes." She traced the edge of the frame with her fingertip. "You don't talk about him, because there's not much to say." His voice was even, but she could hear the weight beneath it. "He built the empire I now run. And he expected me to follow in his footsteps without question." Charlotte turned back to him. "And did you?" Graham exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "For a long time I thought I had to. That my worth was measured by how well I upheld his legacy." She watched him carefully. And now, his gaze met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Now, I'm starting to realize that maybe my worth isn't tied to his expectations." Charlotte's heart ached at the quiet vulnerability in his voice. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "You don't have to be who they want you to be, Graham." His grip tightened slightly. "And who do you think I am?" She smiled, brushing her thumb over his knuckles. "Someone who's still figuring it out." For a long moment, he just looked at her, as if she had said something he hadn't been expecting. Then, without warning, he kissed her. It was slow, unhurried, filled with something deeper than passion. Something real. And in that moment, Charlotte knew whatever happened next, whatever obstacles they still had to face, this was real. And she wasn't going anywhere.